Welcome to the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association's Patients Come First podcast series. Episodes are available on VHHA.com and on popular podcast hosting apps like Apple Podcast, Amazon, Spotify, and many others. We're a member of the Public Health Podcast Network, the Virginia Audio Collective, and the World Podcast Network. Episodes also air Sundays at noon on 100.5 FM, 92.7 FM, and 8:20 AM across Central Virginia, 1650 AM in Hampton Roads, 105.1 FM, and 1050 AM in Lynchburg, and Wednesdays at 1 PM on 93.9 FM in Richmond. Please send any questions, comments, feedback, or guest suggestions to pcfpodcast@vhha.com. Again, that's pcfpodcast@vhha.com. Today, we're thrilled to be joined by Tina Buck, a double transplant patient who receives ongoing care from Sentara Health. Tina's with us to share her story as a 30-year heart transplant survivor, the experience of meeting the family of one of her organ donors, and much more. But before that, welcome to the show, Tina. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we appreciate you taking some time to join us today. Return listeners will know that we generally start these conversations just by getting to know our guests a little bit better before we dive into our main story. So with that in mind, for the benefit of us and for our audience, tell us a little bit about yourself, some things people should know about you and your unique personal story.
Well, when I was 16, I was diagnosed with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, and that's what caused me to have the heart transplant. And 4 years after that, the medicine that I had to take for the heart transplant is what led me to have the kidney transplant.
Thanks for that context. We appreciate that. Are you from Virginia Beach, Hampton Roads area originally?
I've lived in Chesapeake my whole life.
Okay, great. Well, you mentioned you're a double transplant patient. We mentioned that in the intro. Had a heart transplant in the mid-90s, and then several years later, like you mentioned, you're experiencing renal failure, which led to the kidney transplant. In a moment, we'll talk about your personal circumstances with organ transplant, but first I want to just provide a little bit of context about transplants more broadly. Data shows that more than 130,000 Americans are on the National Organ Transplant List, and each day 17 people die waiting for an organ transplant. So as someone who's been through this process yourself twice, can you share your thoughts on the experience of being on the waiting list when time is clearly of the essence in that way?
Well, when I first got put on the transplant list, things have changed quite dramatically since 1994. I was only 15, and so it was still considered experimental back then,
Okay.
and the insurance company didn't even want to cover me. So back then, when you're 15, you don't really know anything about heart transplants other than what you see on ER, which was still a new show back then. So I didn't know anything about heart transplants back then. All I knew was I was thrown into a whole new world of hospitals, EKGs, x-rays, all that, and I just wanted to go back home. They gave me the option of you can have the heart transplant or you can take medicine for the rest of your life. But I think that was just kind of an option that they were throwing out there just to see what I would say. My parents told me no matter what I said, they were still going to make me have the heart transplant anyway. But I did choose the heart transplant. Regardless of what I said, I was still going to be put on that transplant list. Because if I had chose medicine, I would be dead today.
Do you remember sort of obviously, like you said, you were 15 years old and there's a lot of things going on at that point, but do you remember sort of your mental state while you were on the wait list? Were you aware that time was of the essence, or obviously you had those different options to take the medicine and things like that, but what were you sort of thinking at that point as you were put on the wait list?
Well, being O positive made it even harder for me because I could only accept an O positive donor. I could give to anybody else, but I could only receive O positive. So that made the wait list even harder for me. And I was a very small person, just like I am today. I didn't even weigh 100 pounds. So I could either accept a child's heart or a very small adult's heart. So, and of course it has to come within a 4-hour radius. So it had to come from a close proximity to Virginia. And I kept a diary back then, which I still have today, but I don't read very often, and I have not read in very, very many years. I do remember thinking they had me on a lot of medicine, and so they kind of kept me happy, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So it kept me happy enough to not be as miserable as I would have been. Before I got put in the hospital, I remember sitting up, propped up on pillows because I was drowning in lung fluid. My lungs were filling up with so much fluid I couldn't even breathe, but I didn't even understand what that meant until I found out I had heart failure. I was always a really, really skinny kid, and one of the things I had problems with when I was a child was my legs were always really, really skinny. So right before I got put into the hospital, my legs started getting bigger. And I was like, well, maybe I'm finally starting to get some, my legs are starting to get bigger.
Right.
Yay. I'm getting muscle in my legs. I didn't realize it was edema because every time I pushed on my legs, I left a big old dent in it. But when you're 15, you don't know what edema is.
Right.
So, that was one of the things. And to this day, every once in a while, when I take my socks off, I'll always push on my legs just to make sure I don't have any edema.
Yeah, understandable. I can't imagine the situation you're describing where, like you said, you're just thrown into this entirely new world of medicine and hospitals and appointments and medications and all that sort of stuff, and you're 15 trying to navigate it all and figure out what it all means. I mean, it's a crazy situation to be in. I want to provide a little bit more context about organ transplantations in general. So we talked about heart transplants and the waitlist process and everything like that. The volume of organ transplantation procedures has increased over the years. So in 2023, there were a little over 46,000 organ transplants in the U.S., including nearly 28,000 kidney transplants, more than 11,000 liver transplants, and more than 4,500 heart transplants. It hasn't always been that way. And like you said, it was sort of experimental when you got it in the mid-90s. In the 70s and 80s, I think there were often fewer than 100 heart transplants a year, so it's obviously increased since then. When you received your heart transplant in the 90s, about half as many heart transplants occurred each year compared to what they do now. So obviously you received a heart transplant as a teenager. What are some of your memories surrounding that process specifically? And you touched on this a little bit, but perhaps how the transplant climate was different back then. You talked about how it was a little bit more experimental at that point. But talk to us about the process of going through the transplant.
Well, it's like now, even the way they bring the hearts in, like back in 94, they brought them in coolers. They don't do that anymore. They bring them in because if they bring them in the way they did back then, they would have back then they laid their hearts on the side, and now they say if they lay the hearts on the certain side, it damages part of the tissue. The way they suture us up, back in 94, they did it like my sutures are like a 3-ring binder. But now they suture them up with it looks like the best way I can describe it is like a fence. It's kind of done like a fence is. It's the best way I can describe it.
Mm-hmm.
So even that's changed. I don't know anybody that's really left that hasn't had to have either a kidney transplant or a double heart transplant that's still around from 94. They give you a number that your heart transplant was. I think they're in nearly the 200s now from Sentara and Norfolk General. I was number 16.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that tells you how many transplants they've done in the 30 years since I've had mine. Yeah, I was number 16 from 94, and
wow.
I think they're in the 200s now.
Wow, that's interesting. You touched on this briefly. The donor heart you received was from the family of a young girl from North Carolina who tragically passed away in an automobile accident. Since then, I gather that you've sort of forged a relationship with her family. Can you tell us about that and what that relationship has meant to you and what you think it's meant to them? It's
meant a lot to me to know that family, because I tell every heart recipient, don't meet your donor family just because you're curious. Don't ever do that, because it comes with an entire family's worth of emotions. So unless you're emotionally ready, totally emotionally ready to meet that family, don't do it.
Yeah, what has that relationship been like since you have made that decision to go ahead and forge that relationship with them? How has it been special to you since then?
It's been extremely special because when I did meet them, they told me that by meeting me, it was like having Natalie home again, and I really appreciate that from them. I'm extremely close to my heart donor's aunt, and they're like another family to me. Every time we talk to each other, we're like, I love you, heart aunt, I love you, heart niece. So it's very nice because it's almost like having another aunt in the family. It's wonderful.
That's really cool. We mentioned that, so we also touched on the fact that you received a kidney transplant after experiencing renal failure in the late 90s. So I want to go back to that time period. So as someone who has successfully navigated the recovery process from a heart transplant, what was it like? What were your emotions like learning you needed another transplant procedure and that you were going to have to sort of go again, as it were?
I remember the day that happened. I remember sitting on the hospital gurney, and my transplant coordinator, she was pivotal in all of this. She was one of the best. She's still, to me, one of the best people ever. I don't think I would have made it through the heart or the kidney transplant without her. Very, very great person. And I remember her telling me that my kidneys were almost in the same shape my heart was in when she first met me. And I remember thinking that, no, they're just going to tell me this is a lie. And I remember thinking, no, not another transplant. You got to remember, I was only 19 at the time.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, they're just going to say no about this. And I'm going to throw the worst situation out there ever. And they're just going to say, oh, no, Tina, you're telling you no. And I said, not another transplant. And the doctor and her just looked at me like, well, yeah, another transplant. And I was like, no, they've got to be telling me a lie. But dialysis was probably one of the worst times of my life. And every time I see my kidney doctor, he's like, well, they don't last forever, and we're on 27 years now. I hope I never have to go on dialysis ever again. I don't know if I could deal with that over again. I'm glad the kidney has lasted as long as it has. Apparently, that's been a good match, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Sentara also has an organ and heart transplant support group, and I gather you've been an active member of that group and sort of a mentor to other folks, and you obviously provide a really unique sort of situation, having celebrated 30 years with your new heart and 27 years with your kidney. What can you tell us about that group and what it means to be considered a mentor in that group by other members of the group?
Honestly, I didn't even know I was considered a mentor. I like to go in there because out in regular society, you don't meet people who have had transplants very often. And I wanted to be able to try to go somewhere where I could find people who were going through the same problems I have, because the immunosuppressants are very, very harsh on the body. And I wanted to find, a place where other people were going through some of the same problems I have, mainly because of what the immunosuppressants do to us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't imagine having something that life-changing, that, impactful in your life, and then not having anyone to talk about it with or be able to relate to you. So I'm sure that it's been fantastic to have that group. And yeah, I mean, I take your point about not knowing you are seen as a mentor. I can understand and appreciate that. But in some of the articles and things we read about this story, folks did say that. They were like, yeah, Tina's been such a resource to us and such a mentor. So yeah, that's really cool that you've been such an important and pivotal part of that group. So I want to zoom out. So this is one of our final questions. I want to sort of zoom out, take you to a 30,000-foot view of this whole process, having gone through this journey of illness and recovery, and then the second transplant, celebrated 30 years with your new heart, everything in between. I want to know how your perspective on health and life changed over the course of that journey, and then maybe a word. What can you say to folks about the importance of organ donation?
Well, I don't fear dying anymore. So that's a big perspective on life. The biggest thing is, and I've been trying to preach this since '94, I think the biggest part of it is you can't take it with you. So why not just save someone if you can?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a beautiful phrase. You can't take it with you. I think that can be applied to a lot of things in life, not to get too philosophical on you, but I think that's great advice for a lot of different things, but especially as it relates to this topic, and I think you're absolutely right about that. So, I mean, you mentioned you've sort of lost the fear of death. That is an incredibly profound thing to say. So, over the course of this 30-year journey, was it like immediately you felt that way when you were 15 and you got this heart transplant, or did that sort of perspective evolve over the 30 years? How do you feel like you've changed through the process?
I definitely think it's evolved, because I when I first found out about needing a heart, I was petrified of death, and it lasted quite a few years. And now, as I've gotten older, I guess I just don't fear it anymore, because I don't even know what's caused the fear to subside, to go away. But it's just not there anymore, because I don't know if it's just the fact that I'm older now, or I don't know. I mean, so many things have happened to me. It's not just the heart and the kidney. I've had so much go wrong with me that's just not even listed transplant-wise. And it's all due to the immunosuppressants. Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing all that. It has been really fascinating to talk to you. I was, really excited to read your story and excited at the opportunity to speak with you. So thank you for sharing your story with us today. We're nearing the end of our conversation, but before we conclude, we have a tradition on this podcast to close out our episodes by asking our guests 2 sort of surprise questions that are fun and more lighthearted. So to keep things interesting, we've got a list of 10 for you to choose from. So if you would just pick 2 numbers between 1 and 10, I'll read you those corresponding questions just to keep it variable for our return listeners.
4.
Okay, 4, and which other one?
8.
Okay. Number 4. Ooh, this is a fun one. Which, if any, of the following things do you consider most plausible? Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, or UFOs and aliens? If none of those apply, but you believe in something else along those lines, you can share that with us too. But do you believe in any of those things?
Probably UFOs or aliens, but we'd probably want to go and take their land over too.
Aliens have got to be out there, for sure. They've got to be out there. I'm with you on that. Okay, and then number 8. Tell me one memory from your life that whenever you think of it, it makes you smile.
My 12th birthday.
Yeah? What about it?
Yeah. That was before I knew I was sick. I wasn't sick yet, and everything was still good.
Yeah. The innocence of youth, am I right?
Yep.
Good days. Okay. Well, those are 2 great answers. So thank you for that, Tina. And with that, we have come to the close of another episode of the Virginia Hospital and Healthcare Association's Patients Come First podcast. If you like what you heard, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcast and subscribe so you know when new episodes are released. We want to once again thank our guest, Tina Buck, for joining us today. So, Tina, it's been a great pleasure to speak with you. Thanks so much.